Calls for missing persons are all too common in college towns. Most of the time, it's some kid partying late. His mom gets nervous and calls the cops 15 minutes after curfew. More often than not, the kid will just stroll in, clearly impaired, while mom is talking to the cops. Other times it's these Romeo and Juliet cases. The kids think they're in love and they want to get married. But this was different. No one would call Michael a partygoer. He did have a girlfriend, but she was just as upset as everyone else. The last record of anyone talking to him was a text message he sent to his girlfriend about an old house and some prize money. She texted him back to see where he was, but he stopped replying.
Good evening, Kill-dren. I've lost all kinds of things. Socks, remotes, jobs. But having a person go missing is far worse. In tonight's frightening feature, we're going back in time 1 month to find out what happened to Michael. I'm sure there'll be a logical explanation. After all, people don't just disappear, do they?
Before I start, it's important for you to know that Peter was a burnout. He and I were friends during our freshman year of college, and continued to talk even after he dropped out. I moved out of the dorms and into a small apartment my junior year. I didn't see Peter as much. We would talk online every now and then, and text here and there. But that was it. There was a period where we didn't talk at all, for about a month. I wasn't worried. He was a pretty notorious flake, and a drug addict, so I assumed he just stopped caring. Then one night I saw he was on Facebook. Before I could initiate a conversation, he sent me a message. "Michael, man, we need to talk." That was when he told me about the NoEnd House. It allegedly got that name because no one has ever reached the final exit. It was pretty much the same as any of those silly internet challenges, but this one gave you money. The rules were pretty simple and cliché. Reach the final room of the building and you win $500. There were 9 rooms in all. The house was located outside of the city, roughly 4 miles from where I lived. Apparently Peter had tried and failed. He was an addict. If he mixed narcotics and the scary challenge together, he'd be so easy to scare. A paper ghost would get the best of him. He told me it would be too much for anyone. That it was unnatural. I didn't believe him. I told him I would check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 sounded too good to be true. I had to go. I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about the building. Have you ever seen or read something that shouldn't be scary, but for some reason, a chill crawls up your spine? I brushed off the chill and walked towards the building. The feeling of uneasiness only intensified as I opened the front door. My heart slowed, and I let a relieved sigh leave me as I entered. The room looked like a normal hotel lobby, decorated for Halloween. A sign was posted in place of a worker. It read, "Room 1, this way. 8 more to follow. Reach the end and you win." I chuckled and made my way to the first door. The first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle of a Kmart, complete with chic ghosts and animatronic zombies that gave out a static growl when you passed by. At the far end was an exit. It was the only door besides the one I entered through. I brushed through the kitty Halloween decorations and headed for the second room. I was greeted by fog as I opened the door to room 2. It definitely upped the ante in terms of technology. Not only was there a fog machine, but a bat hung from the ceiling and flew in a circle. I could hear a Halloween soundtrack playing, the kind that you'd find at a 99-cent store. I didn't see a stereo, but I guess they must have used a PA system. I stepped over a few toy rats that wheeled around and walked with a puffed chest across to the next area. I reached the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I didn't want to open that door. A feeling of dread hit me so hard I could barely even think. Logic overtook me after a few terrified moments, and I shook it off and entered the next room. Room 3 is when things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a normal room. There was a chair in the middle of a wood-paneled floor. A single lamp in the corner did a poor job of lighting the area, casting a few shadows across the floor and walls. That was the problem. Shadows. Plural. In addition to the chair's shadow, there were others, but there was nothing else in the room. I had barely walked in the door and was already terrified. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even think as I automatically tried to open the door I came through. It was locked from the other side. This set me off. Was someone locking the doors as I progressed? There was no way I would have heard them. Was it a mechanical lock that said automatically? Maybe. But I was too scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair's shadow remained, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk. I used to hallucinate when I was a kid, so I wrote off the shadows as a figment of my imagination and began to feel better as I made it to the halfway point of the room. I looked down as I took my steps. That's when I saw it. Or didn't see it. My shadow wasn't there. I didn't have time to scream. I ran as fast as I could to the other door and dove into room 4 without thinking. The fourth room was possibly the most disturbing. As I closed the door, all the light seemed to be sucked out of the room. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark, never have been, but I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I reached out with my hand to see if I could get any information. All it did was confirm how dark it was. I couldn't even see my hand. But it wasn't just dark. I couldn't hear anything either. It was dead quiet. Even in the quietest of rooms, you can still hear yourself breathing. You can hear yourself being alive. I could not. I began to stumble forward after a few moments, my rapidly beating heart being the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. I wasn't even sure there was one this time. The silence was then broken by a low hum. I felt something behind me and quickly spun around, but could barely even see my nose. Still, I knew it was there. Regardless of how dark it was, I knew something was there. The hum grew louder and closer. It seemed to surround me. But I knew whatever was causing the noise was in front of me, inching closer. I took a step back. I had never felt that kind of fear. I can't even really describe it. I wasn't even scared I was going to die. I was scared of what the alternative was. I was afraid of what this thing had in store for me. Then the lights flashed for a second, and I saw it. Nothing. I saw nothing, and I know I saw nothing there. All at once, the room was again plunged into darkness, and the hum became a wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't handle hearing this goddamn sound for another minute. I ran backwards away from the noise and fumbled for the door handle. I turned it and fell into room 5. Now, before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I am not a drug user. I have had no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis, short of the childhood hallucinations I mentioned earlier, and those were limited to when I was really tired or just waking up. I entered with a clear head. After falling in from the previous room, my view of room 5 was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me. It simply surprised me. Trees had grown into the room and towered above my head. The ceiling in this room was taller than the others, which made me think I was in the center of the house. I got up off the floor, dusted myself off, and took a look around. This was definitely the biggest room of them all. I couldn't even see the door from where I was. Various brush and trees must have blocked my line of sight with the exit. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were going to get scarier, but this was paradise compared to the last room. I also assumed whatever was in room 4 stayed back there. I was incredibly wrong. As I made my way deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would hear if they were in a forest. Chirping bugs, the occasional flap of birds. These sounds appeared to be my only company in the room. That was the thing that bothered me, though. I could hear the bugs and other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the outside, when I first walked up to it, it looked like a regular house. It was definitely on the bigger side, but this was almost a full forest in here. I could only assume the ceiling existed somewhere above the treetops. I couldn't see any walls either. The only way I knew I was still inside was that the floor matched the other rooms. It had the same standard dark wood paneling. I kept walking, hoping that the next tree I passed would reveal the door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a bug fly onto my arm. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt about 10 more land on my skin at different places. I felt them crawl up and down on my arms and legs. A few made their way across my face. I flailed wildly to get them all off, but they just kept crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream, maybe more of a whimper to be honest. I didn't see a single bug. Not one bug was on me, but I could feel them crawl. I heard them fly by my face. I could feel them sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially ones I couldn't see or touch. But these bugs could touch me, and they were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit. So I just crawled, my skin wriggling with the presence of those phantom bugs. After what seemed like hours, I found the door. I grabbed the nearest tree and propped myself up, mindlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from crawling and dealing with whatever was on me. I took a few shaky steps to the door, grabbing each tree on the way for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it, the low hum from before. It was coming from the next room, and it was deeper. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of the bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. As I placed my hand on the doorknob, the bugs were completely gone. But I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I knew that if I let it go, the bugs would return, and there was no way I would make it back to room 4. I just stood there, my head pressed against the door marked 6, and my hand shakily grasping the knob. The hum was so loud, I couldn't even hear myself think. There was nothing I could do but move on. Room 6 was next, and room 6 was hell. I closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut, and my ears ringing. As the door clicked into place, the hum was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise. The door I had just shut was gone. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to room 3, the same chair and lamp, but with the correct amount of shadows this time. The only real difference was that there was no exit door, and the one I came in through was gone. As I said before, I had no previous issues in terms of mental instability, but at that moment, I fell into insanity. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. At first, I scratched softly. The wall was tough, but I knew the door was there somewhere. I just knew it was. I scratched at where the doorknob was. I clawed at the wall frantically with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood. I fell silently to my knees. The only sound in the room was me scratching against the wall. I knew it was just there. I knew if I could just get past this wall.
Are you alright?
I jumped off the ground and spun in one motion. I leaned against the wall behind me and saw what it was that spoke to me. I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl, wearing a soft white dress. She had blonde hair, white skin, and blue eyes. She was the most frightening thing I had ever seen, and I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only larger than normal. It wasn't the devil, but at that moment it might as well have been. It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl. They were the same creature. I can't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same spot. But it was like looking at two separate dimensions. When the girl would come in clearer, the form would vanish, and when the form came in clearer, the girl would vanish. I couldn't speak. My mind was revolting against what it was attempting to process. I had been scared before in my life, and had never been more scared than when I was trapped in that fourth room. But that was before room 6. I just stood there, staring at whatever it was that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped here with it. And then it spoke again.
Michael, you should have listened. 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 Michael, you should have listened.
When it spoke, I heard the words of the little girl. But the other form spoke through my mind, in a voice I won't attempt to describe. There was no other sound. The voice just kept repeating that sentence over and over and over in my mind. And I agreed. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness. Yet I couldn't take my eyes off of what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I passed out. But the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side, my eyes wide open, and the form staring down at me. Scurrying across the floor in front of me was one of those battery-powered rats from the second room. The house was toying with me. But for some reason, seeing that rat pulled my mind back from whatever depths it was headed, and I looked around the room. I was getting out of there. I was determined to get out of that house and live and never think about this place again. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for any opening. The room wasn't very big, so it didn't take long to soak up the entire layout. The demon still taunted me, the voice growing louder as the form stayed rooted where it stood. I placed my hand on the floor, lifted myself up on all fours, and turned to scan the wall behind me. The form, that monster, was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how I shouldn't have come. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. When inspecting the wall, I noticed a large rectangle was scratched into the wood, with the large 7 etched right in the center of it. Somehow in my earlier panic, I must have scratched the 7th door into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just beyond that wall where room 5 previously existed. Room 7 was close. I knew the demon was right behind me, but for some reason it couldn't touch me. I closed my eyes, placed both hands on the large 7, and started pushing.
You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have come here.
I pushed as hard as I could. The demon was now screaming in my ear. It told me I was never leaving. It told me that this was the end. But I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in room 6 with it. Forever. I was not. I pushed and screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew eventually I would push through that wall. I clenched my eyes shut and screamed, and the demon vanished. I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and was greeted by the room as it was when I entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it. But I didn't have time to figure out what happened. I just turned back to the wall and jumped back slightly. What I saw was a door. It wasn't the one I scratched in it, but a regular door with the large 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob. I just stood there for a while, staring at the door. I couldn't stay in room 6. I couldn't. But if this was only room 6, I couldn't imagine what 7 had in store. I must have stood there for an hour, just staring at the 7. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened the door to room 7. I stumbled through the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed, and I realized where I was. I was outside. Not outside like room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung. I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees and tried, but I couldn't. I was finally out of that hell. I didn't even care about the prize that was promised. I turned and saw that the door I just went through was the entrance. I walked to my car and drove home, thinking of how nice a shower sounded. As I pulled up to my place, I felt uneasy. The joy of leaving NoEnd House had faded, and dread was slowly building in my stomach. I shook it off as residual from the house and made my way to the door. I entered and immediately went to my room. There on my bed was my cat, Baskerville. He was the first living thing I had seen all night, and I reached to pet him. He hissed and swiped at my hand. I recoiled in shock. He'd never acted like that. But he was an old cat, so I guess it was whatever. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. After my shower, I went to the kitchen to make something to eat. I walked down the hall and turned into the living room. What I saw there would be forever burned into my mind. My parents were lying on the ground, covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to their bodies, and their heads were placed on their chest, facing me. The most unsettling part was their expressions. They were smiling, as though they were happy to see me. All at once I started sobbing there. I didn't know what happened. They didn't even live with me. I was a mess. Then I saw it. A door that was never there before. A door with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood. I was still in the house. I was standing in my living room, but I was standing in room 7. The faces of my parents smiled wider as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be, but they looked exactly like them. The door marked 8 was across the room, behind the mutilated bodies in front of me. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment I gave up. The smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me where I stood. I nearly collapsed. Then, the hum returned. It was louder than ever, and it filled the house and shook the walls. The hum compelled me to walk. I began to walk, slowly, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk, and the closer I got to my parents, the more intense the humming became. The walls were now shaking so hard it seemed as if they were going to crumble, but still, their faces smiled at me. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. I was now between the 2 bodies, a few feet away from the door. The dismembered hands crawled their way across the carpet towards me, all while the faces continued to stare. New terror washed over me, and I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't want to hear their voices match the voices of my parents. They began to open their mouths, and their hands were inches from my feet. In a dash of desperation, I lunged towards the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. Room 8. I was done. After what I just experienced, I knew there wasn't anything else this house could throw at me. There was nothing short of the fires of hell that I wasn't ready for. Unfortunately, things got more disturbing, more terrifying, and more unspeakable in Roommate. I still have trouble believing what I saw in Roommate. Again, the room was a carbon copy of rooms 3 and 6, but sitting in the usually empty chair was a man. After a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted the fact that the man sitting in the chair was me. Not someone that looked like me. It was me. It was Michael. I walked closer. I had to get a better look, even though I was sure of it. He looked up at me, and I noticed tears in his eyes.
Please, please, please don't do it. Please don't hurt me.
What? I asked. Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
He was sobbing now.
You're gonna hurt me. I know you're gonna hurt me, and I don't want you to hurt me. Don't 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 hurt me.
He sat in the chair, panicking. It was actually pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. Listen, who are you? I was now only a few feet from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet. Standing there talking to myself, I wasn't scared. But I would be soon. Why are you...
You're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me. If you want to leave, you're going to hurt me. Don't hurt me.
Why are you saying this? Just calm down, alright? Let's try to figure this... And then I saw it. The Michael sitting down was wearing the same clothes as me, except for a small red patch on his shirt, embroidered with the number 9.
You're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me. Please don't, you're gonna hurt me.
My eyes didn't leave that small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. The first few doors were plain and simple, but after a while they got a little more ambiguous. 7 was scratched into the wall, but by my own hands. 8 was marked in blood above the bodies of my parents. But 9, this number was a person, a living person. Worse still, it was on a person that looked exactly like me. Michael? I had to ask.
Yes, you're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me, you're gonna hurt me.
He continued to sob. He answered to Michael. He was me. But that 9. I paced around for a few minutes while he sobbed in his chair. The room had no door, and similar to room 6, the door I came through was gone. For some reason, I knew that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and the floor around the chair, sticking my head underneath and seeing if anything was below. Unfortunately, there was. Below the chair was a knife. Attached was a tag that read, "To Michael, from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read that tag was something sinister. I felt sick. The last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under the chair. The other Michael was still sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning. I had so many unanswered questions. Who put this here? And how did they get my name? Not to mention the fact that as I knelt on the cold wood floor, I also sat in that chair, sobbing in protest of being hurt by myself. It was all too much to process. The house and the management had been playing with me this whole time. My thoughts for some reason turned to Peter, and whether or not he got this far. And if he did he meet a Peter sobbing in this very chair? I shook these thoughts out of my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair, and immediately the other Michael went quiet.
Michael,
He said in a sinister voice.
what do you think you're going to do?
I lifted myself from the ground and clenched the knife in my hand. I'm going to get out of here. Michael was still sitting in the chair, though he was very calm now. He looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if he was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly he got up from the chair and stood facing me. It was uncanny. His height, weight, posture, it all matched me. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand and gripped it tighter. I don't know what I was planning to do with it, but I had a feeling I was going to need it.
Now, I'm going to hurt you I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to keep you here.
I didn't respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I had mounted him and looked down, knife poised and ready. He looked up at me, terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. Then the hum returned, low and distant, though I still felt it deep in my body. Michael looked up at me as I looked down at myself. The hum was getting louder, and I felt something inside me snap. With one motion, I slammed the knife into the patch on his chest and ripped down. Blackness fell on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I had ever experienced. Room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to what was completely engulfing me. I wasn't even sure if I was falling after a while. I felt weightless, covered in dark. Then a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed. The sight of my parents entered my mind. I knew it wasn't real, but I had seen it, and the mind has trouble differentiating between what is real and what is not. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what felt like days. The final room. And that's exactly what it was. The end. NoEnd House had an end, and I had reached it. At that moment, I gave up. I knew I would be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I couldn't see, hear. There were no smells. It was like my senses were stolen from me. I felt disembodied and completely lost. I knew where I was. This was hell. Room 9 was hell. Then it happened. A light. One of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt the ground come up from below me, and I was standing. After a moment or two of gathering my thoughts and senses, I slowly walked towards the light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of an unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself back where I started, the lobby of NoEnd House. It was exactly how I left it, still empty, still decorated with childish Halloween decorations. I was still wary of where I was. After a few moments of normalcy, I looked around the place, trying to find anything different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious, yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. Inside was a letter, again handwritten. To Michael, congratulations. You have made it to the end of NoEnd House. Please accept this prize as a token of this great achievement. Yours forever, Management. With the letter were 5 $100 bills. I started laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked out to my car, and I laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I parked my car. I laughed as I approached my door, and I laughed as I looked up and saw the number 10.
And the moral of the story is, it can get worse. You don't need that $500 that bad, and don't listen to guys named Peter. Before we get to this week's top comment, I want to let you all know that every comment is a great comment to me. I depend on all of your likes, comments, and shares. So thanks. This week's top comment goes to Braun Bros and Briar. Ahem. I found a cool documentary about this game, Polybius, on YouTube. Allegedly, the maker of this game was... Oh, come on! Which is a German word that means to erase the senses. Seems like it probably did exist. There are a lot of people who remember playing it when they were just little boils and ghouls. Braun Bros and Briar, Thank you for that extra information about the Polybius game urban legend. You are this week's top commenter. Oh, and for those of you that are worried about Michael, don't be. He beat the system. When Michael went into his apartment, he was in fact still in NoEnd House. Miserable and exhausted, he began to think. Was there a place he could go that was terrible, but he would also be able to sleep? After thinking about this for a few minutes, he excitedly ran out of his building to his car and took off for the most painful place he knew. When he arrived, NoEnd House was powerless. It couldn't think of anything more painful than math class!